All right, good evening. I see everyone has been able to connect, so we'll proceed with tonight's lecture. Okay, so for this evening, I'll be discussing with you structural theories of economic development. Okay, this would be the third approach to the study of the development process in general, and the we've already looked at the neoclassical theories of economic development. Then we've looked at the stages of growth theory, which is a theory of history. So this evening, we'll be doing the structural theories. Okay. The idea behind structural theories is that to differentiate developed from developing economies, one cannot just look at the system. The economic system would refer to all the visible elements that characterize a social system, economic system, and the like. Okay? So whether you are here in the Philippines or in Japan or in Thailand or France, okay, you would see airports, you would see highways, expressways, you would notice universities, cities, government buildings, corporate headquarters, parks, farms and farmlands, factories, but these are visible elements of the economic system. Okay. The idea of structure comes from sociology, and that structure refers to the non-visible elements that characterize social or an economic system, okay, which is what we'll be looking at these structural theories. The structural theories are among original theories of development economics, okay, way back in 1950s, okay, when development economics emerged as a separate discipline within economics. Okay. Among the pioneers were the Lewis model developed by the Jamaican economist, Nobel Prize winner um, William Arthur Lewis. Okay. It was Professor Lewis who came up with that original idea that developing economies were dualistic. Okay. The structure of their economic system was dualistic. This is in contrast to developed countries where they have a fully modernized, homogenized economic structure, whereas the developing countries were dualistic. Okay? They had a modern and a traditional sector coexisting within the same economic system. Now, this model has been refined, of course, severely criticized, but refined and added to. We will be discussing the Lewis model in greater detail much later when we're talking about migration and urbanization, because with the structure of the Lewis model, okay, it put a special emphasis there on the fact of and the importance of rural labor force migrating to the urban areas as part of the process of economic development. The model, in fact, would later be extended and refined with the Feyranis model, okay, which would then develop a model of the agricultural sector, okay, alongside the model of the modern sector, which was what was developed by Professor Lewis. Okay. Now, these two theories we'll be discussing when we talk of migration and urbanization. But there have been further refinements and extensions of the theory. So the one that I shall be presenting was the one that was stylized and completed by the Burmese economist Lamient. Okay, I am taking this from his 1985 lecture from the Asian Development Bank. Okay, and this would be the model organizational dualism as it was developed by Professor Lamient. Okay, so all right, so here is the structure as developed by Professor Min. Okay? So the different uh, individuals and groups in society, when it comes to the economy, can be put together in just a few in order to look at and analyze their interactions as far as the economy is concerned. So you first start with the wage households and the business firms. Okay? So wage households from our microeconomic perspective are those individuals that try to maximize their utility. And they maximize their utility. They want to attain satisfaction, happiness, avoiding pain, like through a wide variety of ways. But it also involves the purchase of goods and services. Okay? So wage households purchase goods and services in order to maximize their utility. And in order to purchase the goods and services, households have to sell their factors of production. Okay? When they sell their labor, they get a wage. When they sell capital, they get profit. When they provide land or space, they then get rental income. Okay? So households receive factor incomes, wage, profit, and rent. And from these factor incomes brought about by the sale of their factor services, meaning to say the services of their factors of production, then they now have the funds in order to buy goods and services. Then, on the other side of the business firms, okay, business firms are engaged in the maximization of their profit. To maximize their profit, they need to generate revenues less their cost. Okay? They produce and sell goods and services. Okay? And the goods and services that they sell would be the consumer goods that wage households purchase. And the expenditure of wage households and consumer goods would be the consumption expenditure, which the business firms would be the revenues. And to produce the goods and services, they have to hire factors of production. They have to hire labor, capital, and land. And they pay for the use of these factors of production. They pay wage for labor, profit for the use of capital, rental for the use of land. And these are their main costs. And maximizing their profits, will be maximizing the difference between their total revenue minus their total cost. Now, this basic relationship illustrates a fundamental feature of economic societies, of modern societies. They have what is called the, I'm sorry, slide is not, it has what's called the circular flow of money, income, and product. Okay? The circular flow of product would involve consumer goods moving from business firms to households and factors of production moving from households to business firms. Okay, these factor services. Okay, the circular flow of income would be the factor payments or the factor incomes moving from business firms to households. And then households expenditure and goods to consumption expenditure is the revenue for business firms. That's their income. Any of the money flows. The money flow would be in the form of the payments to factors of production, factor payments or factor incomes. And then you have the expenditures on goods and services, which are revenue to the firms. The consumption expenditure becoming the revenue to the firms. So you have this circular flow of money, income, and product. And what makes for higher and higher levels of economic activities would be the speed of the circular flow. The faster the circular flow, the greater the level of economic activity. So the higher the GNP per capita that can be attained. Okay? Which is why in developed economies, which are also called by Professor Mint the fully organized economies or the modern sectors, modern economies and the like, okay, the attainment of higher and higher economic activity would be focusing on making the circular flow move faster. Let's consider financial institutions. Financial institutions provide a means for households and business firms to open up savings. Okay, you have households and business firms that could have some surpluses in their earnings, which they can deposit with financial institutions. Okay, now these deposits, financial institutions can then use to provide loans, loanable funds for households and business firms. Much as there are households and business firms who would have surpluses in their earnings, there would be households and business firms that would have a deficit. They would need to make some purchases but don't have the necessary finance or cash at that point in time, which they can then borrow from the financial institutions. Okay. Financial institutions pay an interest to the deposits and they charge an interest on their loans. The difference between the loan interest rate and the deposit interest rate is the interest rate spread, which is the main source of revenue for the financial institutions. And financial institutions are profit maximizing establishments just the same, except that here they their activity involves finance, money. Okay? The provide attracting savings deposits, paying them interest, and providing loans. Okay. Now, consider what financial institutions are able to do. Okay. By providing credit, business firms and wage households can therefore make purchases today, which they will pay using their incomes in the future. Okay. Now, with the interest earning deposits, it provides households and firms with an additional source of income. And what this means is that the current savings of households and firms, okay, can be transferred as future purchases. Okay? The deposits in the financial institutions will earn it interest, and therefore they could use more funds in the future for their purchases. So effectively, what financial institutions do would be to transfer future transactions to current transactions. Okay? They're able to transfer future income into current purchases and to transfer current earnings to future purchases. So in this way, the circular flow is made to move faster. Okay? Which is why nowadays, okay, if one happened to be, say, at the mall and there's a sale at Sara or Rustan's, even without cash, one can make a purchase using a credit card, which is made possible by the financial institutions. Okay? And with this, with these purchases happening, you therefore have greater and greater circular flow and greater economic activity. I would you just excuse me for a minute or so? Okay. All right, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so now let's proceed. Uh, when this particular model was developed back in 1985, the design was such that modern economies do interact with the rest of the world. In fact, the modern economies or fully organized economies are integrated throughout the rest of the world. And the way they connect would be through the business firms. Okay, so you'd have business firms being able to produce goods for sale abroad. Okay? So they engage in exports. Okay, and you also have business firms importing goods and services that would have a market in the local economy. Okay? You have a large range of producers whose main output is really meant for the foreign market, like many Filipino exporters of leather gloves. Okay? And you have business firms importing goods and services, and they also import the inputs to a lot of the goods that they manufacture here and export, such as the leather for leather gloves. They import a lot of the leather. Okay. So most of these transactions, therefore, are being done by way of business firms at the time. But since the 1990s, you have the reemergence of communications technology, which means that a lot of the transactions in the domestic economy can now be done with the foreign sector directly. You have many households that work directly for foreign establishments. They just connecting the internet and either by way of BPOs, business process outsourcing, or direct contracting, so that you have many households able to earn their incomes by providing their factor services directly to the foreign sector. And you also have many wage households able to purchase online from foreign establishments directly. And the same way, you have many households and business firms that are now able to open bank accounts abroad and obtain loans abroad, just as you have foreign establishments opening bank accounts inside our economy and obtaining credit from our own banks here. Like, so effectively, all these transactions can now be done with the foreign sector, given the transport and the communications link. Okay, the main difference between the foreign and the domestic transactions would be that the foreign transactions would require the use of foreign exchange. Apart from that, those transactions are just the same for both domestic and international. And the main difference again would be the need to obtain foreign exchange. Okay. And that's why, if you look at the situation in the European Union, you have a number of countries, about 19, that decided to adopt a common currency. So they're now in the Eurozone. In a sense, by adapting one currency, it speeds up the circular flow even more. Because among these 19 countries, whenever they need to make a transaction with each other, with the foreign countries that are part of the Eurozone, they can do it so very easily, very, very quickly, because they now use the same currency. So the circular flow is able to move even more rapidly. Okay. And that's the reason why there are actually some proposals to do something similar here in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but you might find that a matter of research interest. Okay. So this is how the circular flow moves within an economy. Okay. Then there's government. Okay. Government collects taxes from all of these entities in order to finance the expenditures of government. Okay. And of the major expenditures of government, these are the ones which have a direct bearing on the efficient functioning of the economy. You have external defense, the administration of justice, the provision of infrastructure, and the provision of social services. Okay? Now, external defense systems are meant to reassure the economy that they can handle any possible threat of invasion. You do not need an actual invasion in order to cause the circular flow to slow down. The mere threat of invasion is enough to cause a slowdown in the economy. If there were a threat of a possible invasion, then most households will just reduce their expenditure mainly to the necessities, which would be largely food and water. And food and water is just a very tiny percentage of the total consumption expenditure of households. The bulk of consumption expenditure of households would be in home furnishings, household appliances, electronic gadgets, cars and their maintenance. And once they stop purchasing these, okay, then a lot of business firms start accumulating inventories of these. So they have to reduce production of these. And among the things that they would need to do is to reduce the employment of people. And with more and more people unemployed, so they don't have the necessary factor earnings, factor incomes, then they have to reduce on their consumption expenditure. And the circular flow slows down, and it slows down a lot, okay? Which in many ways is our own experience with the pandemic right now. Since all households were made to stay at home and we just restrict our purchases to food and non-essentials, you have this severe slowdown in the economy. And that's the reason why we had this huge negative GDP growth in 2020, the steepest decrease in GNP since the end of World War II. It's even more steep than the 1984 reduction during the last few years of the Marcos administration, brought about by their mismanagement of the country's external debt index from 1983 to 1984. The one that we're having right now is even more steep than that. It's a manifestation of the severe slowing down of the circular flow. So therefore, in order to deal with such a possibility, governments have to provide for a system for external defense in order to reassure the economy that it can deal with any threat of invasion so that the circular flow can continue to proceed. That, for example, is the experience of South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. Okay, South Korea was always saw itself as under possible threat of invasion from the North Korea, Taiwan from China, Singapore from Malaysia and Indonesia. So they really invested a lot in their external defense system, which is why during all these decades, when you had this threat of invasion present, these economies continued to grow and their circular flow continued to move rapidly. Okay, because the external defense system is able to reassure their local economies. And then there's the administration of justice. Okay? The administration of justice, okay, deals with conflict in society. The case of conflict is normal in any society at any time in history. There will always be conflict. Okay? But the difference is this, for many traditional societies, notice that whenever there's conflict, you would see that in the Game of Thrones and in the Lord of the Rings, and like in case of conflict, then there's all-out war, all-out killings. So you have the destruction of cities and the killing of so many people. So you have a thorough reduction in the labor supply and capital stock, and therefore a severe slowing down of the circular flow. Okay? But in a modern society, the administration of justice is a means by which conflict can be settled in an impartial, non-violent manner. Okay. So by having a system where conflict can be settled in an impartial and non-violent manner, this would preserve the labor supply and preserve capital, and therefore continue to encourage investment, expenditure, and therefore to continue speeding up the circular flow. Okay. When investors know that in case of conflict, there's a means to settle this in a non-violent and impartial way, then they will continue with their investment activity. Households would also continue with their expenditure activity. So you have the circular flow moving more and more rapidly. Okay, you have this infamous scene in the film, the First Wives Club, where the first Mrs. Donald Trump, Ivana Trump, made a cameo appearance, and she told the women, all of whom were divorced, she tell them, don't get, ladies, don't get mad, don't get even, get everything. Okay, and that you can do through the judicial system, which was able to do actually. Okay, especially since at that time there were no prenuptial agreements yet. So that's the administration of justice. Now you have infrastructure. Okay, infra means beneath or under. So if it's beneath this structure, okay, it would be beneath this structure here. Okay, and these items make that structure function more smoothly. The transport, communication, energy, water, and sanitation systems. Okay. So you have the transport system. The transport system allows for the easy movement of people and goods. So it therefore allows the physical circular flow to move rapidly. So the transport system is in place, people and goods can move very easily out, and therefore promote the circular flow even more. The communication system makes transport decisions much more efficient. Okay. With the communication system, one can easily spread the necessary information. One would know if one would still need to go someplace. So with a communication system such as the use of cell phones and the like, one can be alerted at the last minute about, say, the cancellation of a particular meeting or so that one realizes one does not need to go there. So one no longer needs to use the transport system. The communication system has made the transport decision uh, much easier. Okay, and with communication system, with information being relayed, one can then know where to go, where would people go, where would goods flow. Okay, as it is said, if there was only a communication system, so many films, classic films of the past, would be over in a few minutes. Okay, if there's a helicopter and cell phones and the like, okay, Gandalf can easily be in touch with Frodo, Bilbo, and the like, and they can throw that ring into the volcano from a helicopter, and it's all over in 20 minutes. Okay? The same way that Sleepless in Seattle can easily ended if there's only a cell phone to inform, to inform Tom Hanks that uh, the woman is waiting for him over there at the Empire State Building. Okay, so that's what transport to communication system. Energy systems allow for all the business activities to be done on a 24-hour basis. Whereas before, activities are limited by the available sunlight and the like. That no longer needs to be done because of the presence of energy. Activities can be done on a 24-hour basis. Okay? We have an old song here about New York City, which comes from the 1970s, which says, I want to wake up in a city that never sleeps. You see, at that time, New York City was one of the few cities that really did not sleep because they were able to invest in very expensive communication systems that allowed the financial systems in New York to operate on a 24-hour basis. Okay. So there was a sector in New York that was functioning on a 24-hour basis. A lot of the Filipinos I know who were able to get jobs in Wall Street at that time began by the so-called graveyard shift. They worked from midnight until early in the morning dealing with the financial uh, systems in Tokyo and in East Asia when they were open at those hours in New York, which also meant that there were people who would always need to go out to go to the bars or restaurants at those hours. So they did remain open at the time. Okay. So that's why I want to wake up in a city that never sleeps. But because of the development of communications technology and energy, even the poor Philippines, our own cities, Metro Manila, Dumaguete, Cebu, Zamboanga, we are now cities that do not sleep. We are alive 24 hours. We have our business process outsourcing industries very, very much open during the wee hours when it should be sleeping hours here, but still is office hours in the east coast of the USA and in Europe. Okay, so that's why the circular flow moves even faster. It no longer slows down during nighttime. It still continues to function. Then there's the water supply system. Water is, of course, essential for human beings. And for cities to function well and properly, water supply has to be made available. Okay? Most cities emerge whenever a water supply system was present. And there have been very many cities that have disappeared. They have crumbled because they lost their water supply system. So this one is very, very essential for human beings. Okay, and that's why water supply systems have to be invested in. Okay, the water supply of Metro Manila, for example, comes from Angat Dam, and they're looking for additional sources to augment the water supply systems. Okay, New York began in 1985 a 40-year program come up with a much bigger aqueduct. The aqueduct is the huge pipe that brings in huge quantities of water. They haven't completed it yet, but they're still into it. They're going so that it could bring more fresh water from the main sources going to the city itself. China, for example, is investing in huge aqueducts that will bring in water from the Yangtze River all the way to Beijing. And the distance of that is greater than the distance from Baguio to Davao. So it gives you an idea of the importance. of spending on water supply systems. Uh, Los Angeles has the same problem. It's actually a desert city, but what made it possible for that city to emerge would be the huge water supplies it gets from Hoover Dam and from the central California valleys. Okay. Then you have the sanitation system. Okay. The sanitation systems um, are necessary because they prevent the spread of communicable diseases. Okay? When you have major epidemics like what we're having right now, then a lot of people will be debilitated and therefore unable to work. And then you therefore have a slowing down of the economy, just as what we're experiencing right now. Okay. And that's why the sanitation system is important. It minimizes on the spread of communicable diseases. Okay, and this is a very recent uh, phenomenon in human history. Okay, for example, for a long, long time, people thought that tuberculosis was an illness that simply happened. Tuberculosis happened even among the royal families. So Marie Antoinette, for example, became Queen of France because her husband's older brother, who's supposed to be the King of France, died of tuberculosis. So her husband became Louis XVI and she became the Queen of France. Her own son died of tuberculosis. That's even before the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte's only legitimate son also died of tuberculosis. People thought that tuberculosis was the family illness of the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, and they thought that it's an illness that simply happened. Okay? If you recall the film Moulin Rouge, it makes you wonder how is it that Ewan McGregor was not infected by tuberculosis from satin. Eh, naglalampungan na sila doon kaliwat kanan. And all the people in the theater were always around satin. And yet she's the one who died of tuberculosis. You see, uh, when that story of Moulin Rouge was first published, at that time they still didn't know that tuberculosis was a communicable disease. Again, they just thought that the illness happened. It was only in the late 1890s to the 1920s when they discovered that tuberculosis was caused by a bacteria that thrived a lot in sewage, which is why from that point in time, we have the cities in Europe and North America then investing in sewage treatment systems. They invested in sewages and they invested in sewage treatment systems, which is why tuberculosis is no longer a common illness there. And for developing countries like the Philippines, um, you're not uh, people of our social class are not supposed to contract tuberculosis because if you do, then people will wonder, I mean, where do you live? I mean, do you live in a place where there's no proper sewage system that you got is tuberculosis? So that's why sanitation systems are important in making the circular flow move fast. I'm sorry, uh, I'm sorry, I have just a minute or so. Okay. Just a minute. Okay. Hi, kapitbahay. Okay. So again, so that's infrastructure and what infrastructure can do to make the circular flow move faster. Then there's also social services. Okay. The social services uh, focus usually on redistribution, like government expenditures in education, health, housing, and special sectors. Okay. Now, from the tax revenues of government, they would spend on education, health, housing, and special sectors because these are means for what is known as the redistribution of income. Okay. Government would provide for a public education system. So that means it's able to provide for good quality education at no cost, mainly to the low income households. Then they would also provide for healthcare systems, okay, again, for low income households. Okay. And then housing, they could also provide for housing for the low income households. The thing is, by providing for education, healthcare, and housing for the lower income classes, financed by taxes, it would mean that many of the lower income households no longer need to spend on these. What they would have spent on education, health, and housing, they can now spend on other things. And therefore, it makes the circular flow go faster. And effectively, it's a redistribution of income. Redistribution does not involve an outright cash grant, which happens with the conditional cash transfer program, but more in terms of the fact that taxes are financing the availability of good quality education systems, healthcare, and housing at no cost or low cost to the recipients, and therefore it enhances their standard of living. Okay, and with an educated workforce, it said that there'll be greater productivity and therefore greater circular flow. With a healthcare system, it would mean lesser and lesser people who are chronically ill and therefore able to complete an education and able to work regularly and again, therefore move forward and contribute to a faster circular flow. With housing being made available, it means that lots of households are now able to build up their household investments. They're able to purchase household appliances, home furnishings, and like, and therefore add on to the circular flow. Special sectors would refer to those people who are receiving pensions. So you have pensions for the elderly and pensions to people with disabilities. Okay? With these pensions being made available, that for people who under normal circumstance would not be able to earn on their own because they're elderly or they would have disabilities. This means that the recipients can then engage in further consumption expenditure and therefore add on to the circular. Okay? So with these, the circular flow moves faster and therefore it allows for higher levels of economic activity attained. Okay? So when one talks about government taxation, it finances the real expenditures of government, but it has other functions like the redistribution of income, which I just discussed, where more and more of the tax revenues are used to pay for education, healthcare, housing facilities, and pensions for the elderly and people with disability. Okay? So it therefore stretches the standard of living of low-income households. Okay? And taxation can also promote merit wants. Okay? Merit wants refer to particular wants of human beings, which government can judge to be worthwhile and worthy of being encouraged, as opposed to demerit ones. So with demerit ones, either they would declare them illegal or they would simply allow them but impose a steeper tax, okay? Such as the love for gambling, engaging in commercial sex, purchase of illegal of narcotics and the like. When government sees this as demerit wants, they can impose taxes, special taxes on the production and sale of these goods, as opposed to merit ones, where government either provides tax incentives for expenditures on education or government directly provides for free public education, healthcare, and housing. Okay. Now, equity, efficiency, stability, and convenience are the four main characteristics of the ideal tax systems, but no tax system is able to fulfill all these four characteristics. So some choices have to be made. Okay? The collection of value added tax, for example, is very, very efficient. Efficiency means that the tax should yield substantial tax revenue less the costs of administering it. And value added tax is very efficient, but it's not equitable. The same tax would be paid for by the same people, whether high or low income. In contrast, there's greater equity with income tax when people with higher levels of income pay a higher proportion of their income as tax, which makes it more equitable. But it's not really very efficient because there's greater cost managing it. It requires regular monitoring, especially auditing to find out if households are actually honestly fulfilling the correct computation of their income tax and the like. Stability means that for as long as the tax system is not changeable, it will encourage people to keep on paying the tax. And convenience means that the more convenient it is to pay, then the more likely will people pay it. And that's why the value added tax system, for example, is very convenient, as opposed to the income tax system, where one has to fill up a form, follow instructions, and the like. Another one that is not very efficient would be inheritance tax. Okay. The thing about inheritance tax is its main aim is equity. It's supposed to discourage large concentrations of wealth from one generation to another generation. So that's why a tax is imposed on the value of one's inheritance. Okay? And that's why it's not very efficient. Okay, governments throughout the world actually do not generate so much revenue from you because its primary purpose is equity. And in fact, that's happening. Many would involve na to reduce on their inheritance tax. They would actually set up foundations and they'll start donating a portion of the inheritance to various charitable activities. And okay, it's also not that convenient pay, given that uh, one has to estimate the total value of the estate before the tax due can be computed. Right. So this is the developed economy. Okay. Okay, I will not discuss public goods so much anymore. And I'll say that yes, infrastructure is a major expenditure of government. In a developed economy, fully modern economic systems, it have the following characteristics. There is a high degree of specialization of economic functions, a high degree of monetization of transactions, and a very high degree of homogenization of goods and services. Okay? Economic functions are highly specialized, where you have households specializing in the consumption of goods and services and the supply of factors of production, and firms specializing in the production and sale of goods and services and in the hiring of factors of production. Okay? Households do not do any production. Okay? If ever households do any production of food, such as baking or having their own herb gardens and the like, the primary purpose of these activities is leisure. Okay, the bulk of what they need they actually purchase because of this high degree of specialization of economic functions. So the financial institutions are specialized in providing for savings arrangements and providing credit. Government is specialized in doing these functions. Okay, so because of the high degree of specialization of economic functions, the most convenient way to obtain goods and services is through the exchange of money. So you have a very high degree of monetization of transactions. More and more activities are being monetized. Okay. And the idea here is especially that even time gets to be monetized and the like. Okay. Just to give you an idea, you have, say, in many government offices here in the Philippines, they have signs there, such as when one renews one's license or obtains one's passport, or one has to settle a traffic violation and the like. Okay? There are these signs that say that fixers are not allowed, do not approach fixers, and they try as much as possible to show the procedure so that people who go there can follow the procedure and it can be done and the like. But still, you have to go there. You have to show up. The United States and Europe, they have people who do the fixing for you. They're called service expediters. Okay? Their job is completely legal. They register as a service expediters. So therefore, they represent people who pay them, people who really don't have the time to go to government offices, so that they're the ones who settle traffic violations, obtain their updated licenses and passports and the like. So here, it's a case of monetization. Okay? By providing for this, it makes the circular flow move faster. Okay, in contrast here, they have managed to severely reduce the role of fixers, and yet uh, people still have to go to these offices, and that would substantially reduce on the circular flow. Okay. And then finally, you have homogenization of goods and services. Since goods and services have to be produced for a large market, both domestic and foreign, the quality features get to be standardized, they get to be homogenized, okay? Especially since they undergo a process of mass production. There are a classic example here I give is, say, the puto. The homogenized puto from the 1960s is the one developed by Goldilocks. It's essentially still using rice flour. Yung sa malagkit. Okay. And usually small and it's usually round. With sometimes a bit of cheese. Usually yellowish or purple, pink, and the like. So they do this so that it would mass produce, homogenized, and the like. As I'll hint later, there actually are many different varieties of food in different parts of the Philippines. There's puto binyan in Pambinyan, Laguna, which is flat, a bit big, yellowish, oblong. Then you have yung mga gabilaong sa Bulacan, okay, which are cut in trapezoidal shapes. Then you have the puto that is puto polo, which is very, very small, very, very small, okay, shaped like a cupcake. Okay. And you have the puto, which would be wrapped in banana leaf, boiled. The basic ingredient is the same, like it, rice flour, but they're different shapes, sizes, and colors, and these are not the homogenized type of puto. In the same way, services are also homogenized. Okay, for you to become a professional, you all have to know your computer skills, you know how to do word processing and spreadsheet operations, and you know how to deal with email, internet, Zoom, and the like. Okay? And that's because you now work for a much bigger market here, and they're expecting these types of capabilities. And that's why there's greater and greater homogenization of goods and services in a fully modern society. Okay, so this is the nature of a developed economy, a fully modern economic system or a fully organized economy with a very rapid circular flow. And you have the case of a very high degree of specialization of economic functions, a very high degree of monetization of transactions, and a very high degree of homogenization of goods and services. Now, what is a developing economy? The developing economy is supposed to have a dualistic economic structure. Okay? Historically, the modern sectors of developed economies, okay, began as traditional sectors, which would mean sectors with a low degree of specialization of economic functions, low degree of monetization of transactions, and a low degree of homogenization of goods and services. Okay? But they evolved to become fully modern economic systems like this. And these fully modern economic systems are integrated throughout the whole world. Okay? Now, but for developing countries, there's a part there. They do have the modern sector, but they have a sector that is no longer traditional, but not yet fully integrated in the modern sector. And that's called the informal sector. And that's why developing economies have a dualistic structure. Okay? So if I can declare a break for about 5 minutes, okay, and we'll continue after the 5 minute break. So if I can stop the recording for a few minutes, okay? So you can relax, rest for about 5 minutes. I'll see you in 5 minutes time. Okay. Ay, ay, ay. Ang init na. Ang init na ng panahon. It's going to be summer. And ayan, nasa pandemic pa rin tayo. But anyway, we always try to be hopeful. Okay, so let me check. Uh-huh. Okay, so let's proceed. The the dualistic economy, which is the nature of a developing economy, would have a modern sector and now an informal sector. It's no longer called a traditional sector. Professor Lewis had a very specific description of what the traditional sector is. Nowadays, traditional sectors are not considered to be very common anymore. There are very few of them left. Okay, they are said to be. Just a minute. Okay, what are how do you do this? Miss Bernardo. Just a minute. Oh, there. Okay, right, good. Okay, so so traditional sectors are no longer seen to be quite common throughout the world, okay? Such as maybe a few primitive societies left in the Amazon, in New Guinea, for example. But for many developing countries, their traditional sectors perhaps are no longer there, but they have not yet become fully integrated into the modern sector. So they become the informal sector. So to understand how the informal sector operates, okay, we have to keep in mind that this sector would be the sector with a low degree of specialization of economic functions, a low degree of monetization of transactions, and a low degree of homogenization of goods and services. And it coexists with the modern sector. And if therefore I would I would uh, move forward, okay, it would mean as well that the informal sector does not have much of an infrastructure link with the modern sector. Okay. So to understand how the modern sector, so how the informal sector operates, we'll need to look at how the different aspects of the informal sector operate. Okay. What Mint does is to describe the informal sector by looking at the four main macroeconomic sectors: the goods sector, the labor sector, the money sector, and the governance sector. Let's begin by looking at the informal sector, the goods market. Now, a characteristic of developing economies would be a dualistic economy. And the manifestation of a dualistic economy is very, very wide price disparities. Price disparities are common in developed countries. But when you have an informal sector, the price disparity is much wider. So, for example, in the goods market, there are three main causes of price disparities. You have the retail wholesale price variation, the seasonal price variation, and the geographic price variation. Okay. Now, from the retail to the wholesale level, okay, from the wholesale to the retail level, there's a price variation because the retailer has to recover the transport and storage cost and to have his or her own markup. Okay, so that's why the retail level is more expensive than wholesale level. Okay, But in developing countries with an informal sector, the variation is much wider because of a huge transport and storage cost. Okay. Now, in many developed countries, wholesale markets are usually located outside the centers of the cities. And that's because the main market for wholesalers are store owners, which is why one can purchase so many items there in huge bulk, huge quantities of soaps, laundry detergents, uh, bottled water supplies, and the like. And by locating outside the city centers, they're therefore accessible to retailers that live in city centers or in nearby cities. So they go to these wholesale markets which are outside the city centers. Okay. But in developing countries like the Philippines, the wholesale markets are right inside the city centers. Okay, you have the Macro and the Price Club, SNR, right inside the city centers because the retail wholesale price variation is very, very wide, largely because of the very high transport cost and the very high storage cost. Okay, so for example, you have lots of imported goods arriving in Metro Manila at our main container port, which is in the Port of Manila. And they have to get through the traffic of Metro Manila from that particular loading area at the container port to the wholesale markets. So there's huge transport cost and a huge storage cost. And that's why um, for many high-income households, okay, they are willing to purchase in bulk and take advantage of the very, very low per unit cost of these wholesale goods by going over to the wholesale markets, which are right here at the center of the city. Okay. Now, when these wholesale goods are brought to the retail, the price difference is much, much bigger because of the huge cost of transport and storage. Okay. Then you have seasonal price variations and geographic price variations. Okay. Seasonal and geographic price variations can be minimized if one can arbitrage between two markets. Okay. Arbitrage is the ability to buy and sell at two markets. Okay. So for example, in the foreign exchange market, one can arbitrage. So say you can trade at the foreign exchange markets here in Metro Manila at the same time with Hong Kong, Tokyo, and the like. And the effect of being able to arbitrage in the foreign exchange markets is that the foreign exchange rate end up being the same. Okay? So for as long as one can arbitrage between two markets, okay, the price differences between those two markets can be minimized. But it would require that there is some form of a transport and communications link among the two markets. Okay. For example, seasonal price variations. Goods that are in season have a much, much lower price as opposed to when they are off season. Okay. And when it comes to fruits like apples and the like, okay, the during the autumn months from September, October, and like, apple prices are very low in China. In Australia and New Zealand, they're below during March, April, May, when it's autumn in Australia and New Zealand. Okay. So during these seasons, okay, you have very low prices for apples in China and in Australia and New Zealand. But for as long as you can easily transport these goods, okay, the price difference can be minimized. So one can obtain apples in September and October in China, and March, April, May, one can get that in Australia. Okay? For as long as you have a transport and communications link. Okay, and that's where the problem arises. Okay, here in the Philippines, for example, a lot of our watermelons actually sell for negative prices during the summer months, April, May, June, when they are abundant. Although lots of bakwan or watermelons are able to reach the markets here in Metro Manila, huge quantities are actually left to rot. Just like all those tomatoes that were left to rot because of the restrictions in the movement of food during this quarantine. Okay. When a lot of those watermelons are left to rot, then the effective price reaches negative. That's because they could not get the necessary storage facility and the transport facility to bring these huge quantities of watermelons into the markets in Metro Manila and other cities here in the Philippines. Okay. Then, of course, there's geographic price variations that some goods would have a lower price in certain places compared to other places. In developed countries, the price difference is usually due to differences in taxes. Okay. In the United States, for example, sales taxes are implemented by states, and some states have a lower sales tax compared to others. Okay, which is usually the joke among many sitcoms set in New York City, where they would where you have the Jewish households going all the way to New Jersey and making purchases there because New Jersey charges a lower sales tax than New York. Okay? But in developing countries, the geographic price differences also widened again by the transport systems. Okay, for example, a lot of fresh vegetables like cauliflower, beans, and uh, lettuce and the like are much cheaper in Baguio. Okay, especially when you talk about these temperate zone vegetables, which are very much in demand by the higher income classes here in Metro Manila. Okay, the beans, for example, what we call Baguio beans, those are temperate zone beans. Okay, because tropical zone beans are the sitaw string beans. That's why in other countries, what we call Baguio beans, they just call them beans because that's how their beans are like. Okay, they're temperate zone beans. Okay. Now, when these vegetables are brought to Manila, for them to retain their freshness, they have to be in refrigerated trucks. And many of these trucks have to wade through the traffic situation in Metro Manila. That's why only a very small quantity of these are able to reach Metro Manila with a certain freshness, and their prices here are much higher compared to what they would be like at the markets in Baguio. Okay. Now, if you were a developed economy, this is how the situation would be like. What if there is a train used by both passengers and by cargo that can start at La Trinidad Valley, go under Baguio, okay, then re-emerge, and then cross Central Plain. And once it gets to Metro Manila, it goes underground until it reaches a wholesale market for vegetables, perhaps somewhere EGC. Okay? And the train can have several refrigerated cars and can then bring those huge quantities of fresh temperate zone vegetables from the markets around Baguio over the markets here in Metro Manila. Imagine the huge supply that would be made available here and therefore the lower prices. Okay. But we don't have the transport system. Okay. We have a dualistic economic system. Then the labor market. A characteristic of the labor market in the modern sector, the formal labor market, would be the presence of a wage contract, clear job description, clear hours of work, and place of work. Okay? The hours of work and place of work would be a clear manifestation of specialization. Space is specialized, and so is time, which is why there is a specialized place of work. The workplace is different from the residential place, okay, which makes this pandemic really a problematic thing because you now work from home. But in a truly modern economic system, okay, the place is specialized. So a place of work is different from the place of residence. Okay, and the hours of work also are specialized. Work hours are separate from one's own personal time, one's own leisure. Okay, so with this, you have the formal sector labor. Okay, now the informal sector, the labor market, is not that straightforward. Usually, the informal sector, yung tinatawag natin squatters area. Outwardly, they all look residential. Okay? They are. People live there. But actually, the space is not that specialized because a lot of these residential units are also places where businesses are going on. A lot of these businesses are those that require low capital, very simple technology, and labor-intensive activities. So they're usually backyard operations, and they would have food processing, mga karinderya, they cook meals, provide them, and nagrarasyon sila. And like also recycling activities, lots of recycling going on, and handicrafts such as making furniture, home furnishings, and the like, at saka mga modista, tailors, and the like, repair activities, and personal domestic services such as what you call this, barber shops, um, beauty parlors, and the like. And they're right there where the residences are. And at the same time, the people they hire are not exactly regular laborers. They could be members of the family or old friends, which is why they don't get a regular type of a job. Wage. Their earnings is a combination of wage and non-wage benefits such as say free board and lodging. And they would have informal arrangements on the tasks, hours, place of work. They can take leaves in order to help in the harvest back home. They can easily obtain credit from their bosses. And the people that work with them are usually family members. Okay. So the result here is that you do have a difference, a wide difference in the wages being paid in the informal sector and with the formal sector. Okay. Which is why in the informal sector, you cannot impose minimum wage laws, occupational safety, hygiene, and product standards. And it's also the explanation as to why the informal sector is not easily included in national income accounts and in government data. Like why? Because a lot of the national income accounts obtain their data from business firms and financial institutions. Okay, it's from business firms that they get information on total consumption expenditure, investment by firms, exports minus imports, net factor income. They get that from financial institutions. Okay. They also get from business firms information on wage, rent, interest, profit, on indirect business taxes paid, okay, and their expenses on maintenance, which would be used for estimating depreciation, and also from business firms, from which they then obtain data on the gross value added. Okay? So when you are in the informal sector, you cannot obtain that data from informal sector households. Okay? So that's the reason why the informal sector cannot be included in gross national product accounting. They can only make some estimates, but the actual level of production, investment, and income being generated in the informal sector cannot be easily integrated with the national income accounts, because the national income accounts presume the specialization of the workplace, the firms, from the residential area, the households. Okay. Then you have the credit market. Okay. The formal credit market, which is in the banks, do charge an interest rate, but they do have high transactions cost. Okay. So, for example, when your cheapest loan one can get from the banks would be, say, car loans. Okay. The minimum car loan is about 150,000 pesos. The interest rate is about, I think right now about 13%. Okay. But it involves very, very high transactions cost. One has to send in documents to show one's capacity pay, and a completely anonymous credit investigator then look at one's documents and make the decision whether to grant you the loan. In contrast, in the informal sector, they have higher interest rates. In the 5-6 system, for every 5 pesos borrowed, you pay back 6 pesos in 1 month. You're talking here about an effective 20% per month interest rate, or 240% annual interest. But in the informal sector, though, the transactions costs are low. And why is that? In the informal sector, the amount that they borrow is not very huge. No one borrows 150,000. It's the minimum for banks. Okay. In the informal sector, 10,000 pesos will be very, very large loan. Okay. And they usually borrow that to pay for tuition, or for some purchases of raw materials for one's business. And given that the amount is not that large, they can pay it off in a few months' time. Moreover, the transactions cost are low. And why is that? Okay. There have been studies before. I remember the study by Barda, right, that mentioned that there are actually a lot of informal credits in many communities throughout the world. And therefore, he made the conclusion that informal creditors were competing with each other, have a perfectly competitive market. When in fact, if one were to closely study, there's actually a geographic monopoly. Okay? Although there are many informal creditors in an informal community, the informal creditors have their own geographic area. Okay? And they only lend to people they know. And that's why the transactions cost is much lower. Okay? There's not much need for documentation. Once you approach and the person knows you, they provide you with the loan and they charge you with the interest rate. So there's much lower transactions cost, even though there's a higher interest rate. And effectively, it's a completely different market. It's not the sort of market which is being serviced or can be serviced by the formal banking systems. Okay. So finally, of the government sector, it's clear that in order to integrate the informal sector, to the modern sector, one would therefore need to invest in infrastructure to integrate the informal sector with the modern sector. Okay. The problem here would be the sources of revenue. Okay. In terms of taxation, it's very, very difficult to impose and collect income tax in the informal sector. So there'd be a huge reliance on indirect taxes. And therefore, the ability of government to generate the necessary revenues to pay for the infrastructure expenditure is limited. In fact, though there are severe limitations in the ability of governments in a dualistic economy to generate the necessary revenues, it is what made for development in places like Singapore. Okay? Here is an example of a dualistic economy. This is over at Quirino Highway. Okay? You have here a fully modern residential unit, and here the informal sector. If you look at the informal sector, these all look like residential units outside, but there's a lot of businesses going on here, and that's not possible in this condominium apartment building. Moreover, the condominium apartment building, before it can actually be constructed, it needed to get through approvals, especially in terms of its engineering, and most especially in terms of its floor plan. The floor plan has to be very clear so that they know the passageways, fire exits, elevators, and the like. And as such, it's therefore easy to impose restrictions on the uses that these units are just for residential. They may not be used for commercial purposes. Commercial purposes may be done at the lower floors. Okay. So they've specialized the space, which is not the case with these informal sectors. You don't even know where the passageways are. Okay? Here are the businesses happening in the informal sector, food processing, the flower market in Lumenfleet, and then you have furniture making, and the furniture is usually made of wood, which is known technology. So there's lots of businesses going on there, lots of incomes happening and the like. Okay, but in terms of long-term economic development, okay, the model here is what Singapore did. Here's an informal sector community over in Lima in Peru, and these are residential buildings in Singapore. That's what Singapore did to integrate their informal sectors. Okay, keep in mind that there's the need to integrate the informal sector with the modern by providing them with the necessary infrastructure, transport, communication, energy, water, and sanitation. Singapore did it by constructing these massive housing units. Okay. The housing units were located in parts of the city which are not too far away from the commercial centers and the office spaces. So there is transport access from these residential units to the places of work. Okay. So they can walk or just take a short mass transit ride to their offices and to the commercial centers because these residential units were constructed um, nearby. So there is some form of central urban planning. And these units provide the infrastructure link. The housing units here all have that transport access. They have the communications link. They all have wireless and telephone lines connecting each unit. And all of these, of course, have their necessary electric electricity, and they also have their water pipes and their sewage systems. So all of the infrastructure requirements have been made available. So many of these households have become integrated with the modern sector. Ground floors here could well house commercial establishments, but the specialization of space is fully enforced. So the upper units are all residential in nature, the lower commercial and the like. Okay. And a very important issue in many cities and towns is space. Okay. So in addition to providing space for housing, for those who are in the informal sector, you do need space for the necessary infrastructure, which is why in many cities, a lot of the infrastructure would have to go underground. You have to look at these underground train systems and the like. And also, you need water pipes and sewer lines underground, plus electric power cables, telecommunication cables, all made to go underground in order that space could be created. Okay? And that's a major problem here in Metro Manila. Okay, it's difficult to construct underground because of the huge cost and expense. And the fact is that a lot of the spaces in Metro Manila are privatized. A lot of the roads are inside private residential areas where access to the roads are restricted. Okay. And space, therefore, is so restricted that many low income people have to live outside Metro Manila. And that's why you have a problem here when they impose the quarantine and say that only essential workers, nurses, and the like can move around and enter the cities in order to work at the hospitals and the like. And they completely ignore the fact that many of the essential workers have low incomes and therefore cannot afford to live inside NCR and have to live outside. So you have the problem that they could not enter the city in the first few weeks of quarantine because of the restriction on the entry of people and vehicles into Metro Manila and the fact that they would not allow mass transit. But that's the only way for these low income workers to reach their jobs within Metro Manila. That's why he had massive traffic jams in Marcos Highway because the essential workers needed for the hospitals, retail establishments, and the like live outside Metro Manila and have to rely on mass transit. Okay. So anyway, uh, oh, I finished reasonably early, so about 10 minutes earlier than I planned. So, are there any questions? So this is therefore what the structural theories are about. What an informal sector is, what the modern sector is, and what has been done successfully to integrate the informal with the modern to attain developed country status, which is what Singapore did. So uh, our next topic will then be Marxian and neo-Marxian theories of economic development. So are there any questions or comments? Okay. So if there are none, I actually am so exhausted right now because it's so warm nowadays. Much warmer. So all right. So I'll be posting this recording in our Canvas websites. And so I'll see you all next week. Okay? Right. So Good evening, all of you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
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 Thank
Thank
you, sir.
you.
My
Good
pleasure.
evening.
Evening.
Good night.